Here's why you should care about James Davision Hunter. If you've heard the word culture wars, he's the guy who coined the term in English. I mean, so he's there.
Right.
He wrote a book called When the Shooting Begins, or When the Shooting Starts, 10 days before it came out, 10 days before the first abortion shootings happened. Like Cameron already mentioned, he wrote To Change the World in 2010, which if you look at what's happening within the Christian church between like 2016 and 2020, he basically nailed it prophetically. So he's kind of like sociologically the Warren Buffett of, I mean, like if you want to invest in somebody who has a good track record here, James Davision Hunter is worth paying attention to. And that's going to be terrifying as you listen to some of the things that he's about to say.
Hello and welcome to Thinking Out Loud. I'm your co-host, Cameron McAllister.
And I'm your co-host, Nathan Rittenhouse.
All right, we're going to push some buttons today. Well, we're going to let somebody else push them for us, but this is somebody we really respect. We've talked about him on the podcast before. He is none other than world-renowned, celebrity, famous James Davision Hunter. Okay, there's a chance that celebrity is a very relative term here. So let me tell you a little bit about who James Davision Hunter is and why, and then I'll let Nathan chime in too. I'm going to just set this up also by saying why you should care about this man, who is, it's true, he's a dusty academic, and he writes in some ways dusty academic books, although these books are very well written, which, if you know anything without being too snarky, academics don't always write very well. We'll just say that. But Hunter is a very elegant writer, so that helps too. If you've heard us reference, if you've got your bingo cards in front of you, rather, you've probably To Change the World should probably be on that bingo board. Just gonna say that. Nathan and I reference that book all the time. That's James Davision Hunter. I believe that came out in 2012, 2011, something like that. 2010. Wow. Well, Hunter was writing before that too. He wrote Culture Wars. So he is a sociologist, and he is at the University of Virginia. He is also the director of the Institute for, I'm gonna botch the title now. I think it's Cultural Change. That might be wrong, but here's the takeaway there. They put out
edits the Hedgehog Review.
Yeah, I was gonna say they put out a quarterly journal called the Hedgehog Review, which is superb, by the way. Excellent writing, some of the best cultural analysis that you're going to get in a periodical. I think it's very good. But so he's doing very good work, but he has a very incisive read on culture and how it actually changes. And he has a new book coming out called Democracy and Solidarity. And we want to talk a little bit about some of what he says in that book, so I think we're going to kick the beehive a little bit on this one. But now, Nathan, anything you want to add about the significance of Hunter?
Yeah, so here's why you should care about James Davision Hunter. If you've heard the word culture wars, he's the guy who coined the term in English. I mean, so he's there.
Right.
He wrote a book called When the Shooting Begins, or When the Shooting Starts, 10 days before it came out, 10 days before the first abortion shootings happened. Like Cameron already mentioned, he wrote To Change the World in 2010, which if you look at what's happening within the Christian church between like 2016 and 2020, he basically nailed it prophetically. So he's kind of like sociologically the Warren Buffett of, I mean, like if you want to invest in somebody who has a good track record here, James Davision Hunter is worth paying attention to. And that's going to be terrifying as you listen to some of the things that he's about to say. Now, one of the other things that is interesting about him is he said the day that he gained tenure at the University of Virginia, he dropped out of the American Sociology Society, because he said that's an institution that's totally captured by the left and there's no room for creative thinking within it. And he said that in 1992, he had a colleague who said, "Why are you even talking about culture? This is just a mopping up process. Like everything culturally has already been won by the left. There's no war here. There's no battle. It's done." And he's like, but you don't understand the role that ideology and religion and culture plays outside of just a couple institutions that sociologists usually focus on. So he's been willing to go against the grain. And I think he has the results to show that he's the one who has the best read on what's happening. That's why I think we should, when he writes something that's slightly dismaying, it's worth paying attention to.
I think it's also worth mentioning he is a Christian. And so I did not say that earlier. And I say that now because in his earlier writings, that was not apparent. You wouldn't have concluded he was necessarily secular or anything, but he wasn't very forthright about his religious convictions. He is in To Change the World, and he's fairly open about that now. So it's worth pointing out. Let's start this off with something that an observation he made in To Change the World. He continues in this new book that flies in the face of many evangelical assumptions about cultural change. And it's this: cultures really change, according to Hunter. If you just want to look on paper, they are changed by elites. And so by elites, he means education, higher education, technology, media. Those are really the key. The scientific community as well. So those are key centers of influence. So notice also, this is a relatively small group of people in each of these institutions named, but they exercise outsized influence. But think about one of the examples he gives, actually, is the LGBTQIA plus. That's changing every day. I'm not sure I got that right. I think I did, but we'll see. It'll be outdated in 2 weeks. But the coalition of this coalition, which is, again, comprises a relatively small, very small minority, but has exercised an outsized influence on the culture at large. And that's because they're highly educated people operating in many elite centers, and they're helping to change the cultural mood and have done so for a long time in a very skilled fashion. So that brings us into a point of tension, because evangelical sensibilities, and Hunter is not the only one to make this observation. Mark Knoll says this. I mean, basically anybody who studies evangelicalism has made the observation. Evangelicals are populist in their sensibilities, and they tend to be anti-elitist, or at least suspicious of cultural elites. And so that leaves only one sector for contending in the kind of battle for the culture, and that is politics. And so you see that. So in other words, evangelicals don't have a real presence in any of these other highly influential sectors. Well, not one that makes a difference.
Yeah, but let me jump in here.
So they've leaned heavily. Yeah, please do.
Well, the point he's making is it's not that they've just leaned heavily in it. He says that partisan politics is the only place that conservatives have any even remote voice. So he said take they've got of your other. Yep. He said it's the only thing left, and that's why he sympathetically, I think, says that evangelicals are particularly excited about politics, because it's the only category where they have any say or influence in anything, or even have a voice. So he's not saying that that's good. He's just saying that's the way that it is. But it also explains to those on the left, like, why are Christians or evangelicals so fired up about this stuff? It's like, well, literally they're backed into a corner where this is now their only avenue of cultural engagement.
Yeah, and so let's stay here for just a second, because I think he is sympathetic there, and that's important to point out, because I've heard, Nathan, and from plenty of people, that one of the great scourges of evangelicalism right now is political idolatry. Okay, I think you and I both hear that, and yes, and it's true. But there's another side to this story as well. It's not all political idolatry. I think some people genuinely, are trying to think, okay, they're trying to honor their conscience. So they're trying to think tactically as well. Now, bear in mind, both Nathan and I are not in the all in on the, the politics kind of strategy, but we want to give a sympathetic reading to this too. So you think you evaluate all your options. You think, how can I make a positive difference in my country? I really care about my country. I really care about these extremely important, vital issues. So what do I do? Well, voting is going to be one of the most important ways I can exercise that power. All these other domains are taken over, so to speak. I mean, think about the fact that Hunter immediately he gets tenure and he withdraws from the Guild of Sociologists. I mean, that's pretty telling. You have a cutting edge sociologist who says, "Up it's basically it's over there. There's any room for creative thinking or anything. No real intellectual diversity." Well, that's bad. It's really bad.
Okay, so but Cameron, let me put some teeth to this, or give some specific examples. So he's acknowledging that conservatives have been pushed only into political conversations, but so let's try to balance this out, because he would say, quote, I wrote this quote down: conservatives expect law to do the work of culture.
Oh, I was hoping you get there. Yeah. Let's talk about that.
The law is not the place where culture is formed. Now, it's the only place where Christians feel like they have a voice, but it isn't the place where culture is formed. And this isn't just Hollywood. He's like book publishing and every other form of controlling what's dispersed is largely controlled by center left to left. So for example, he would say, why has race been such a difficult thing for us to process? He said, look, it's easy. You had the Emancipation Proclamation. You had a legal declaration on something that the country had not culturally worked through yet. And so something became legal that people didn't have the ability to process. He said the same thing happened with Roe v. Wade. Is back in the day, you had three branches of, the core of the government state something that our culture had not yet accepted culturally, and it turned into mayhem. So he said, passing a law that the culture can't process never works. And it's short-lived if you pass something that the culture is against. So he said, here are the two big evangelical Christian wins of the past: the Scopes trial and prohibition. Now, if you're thinking about the use of the teaching of evolution and the use of alcohol in our country, you would not say, wow, those were really deep, long-lasting wins that shaped our culture. So I don't know how you feel about this. Hunter says 100% chance that Dobbs is overturned. He said it doesn't matter who you elect as president next. The way the cultural elites want it to be is the way that it's going to go, and there's nothing in our culture. And he gets more pessimistic because he says a great awakening, a religious great awakening in our nation would not change that. This is weird. So let's break this down. So he said a religious great awakening would not change the direction of our culture unless it deeply convicted the hearts of a handful of individuals who control elite institutions. And then it'd be difficult even there. So that's a pretty pessimistic view for somebody who is probably one of the most renowned sociologists in our world to say. And so it's haunting, but because I can hear Christians listening to say, no, overturning Roe v. Wade, a massive political win. And this is where a really helpful phrase from Hunter comes in. He makes a distinction between the political weather and the political climate.
And the climate.
So if you look at climate, let's talk about meteorology for a second. The climate averages over a 30-year period. The weather is what's happening 15 minutes from now. And so you might get some wins in the political weather, but if you look at the overall arc of our political climate right now, so Trump and Harris, those are thunderstorms on the horizon. That's not part of a deep cycle in the magnetic, field of the earth or the jet stream. The political climate is fixed in some ways. The political weather plays into it, but the weather is a byproduct of the climate, not the other way around. And even if you have these little blips, if you look at the overall arc of it, he's rather pessimistic, simply because he would say on the solidarity front is that historically the things that drew us together as a nation were that we had something we could all get excited about, or that we could all, that's a positive solidarity, or something that we were all against, negative solidarity. So that's 9/11, any war,
Cold War.
We're all rooting for the Cold War. Yeah. So he would say it's interesting that we live in a time in which there's no positive nor is there a negative solidarity. And he said, what's wild is that you now have a new national global crisis like COVID that did not produce solidarity. And so he said, what we have now is the only solidarity that you have is with your tribe, but none of that is felt at a national level. And so these are I mean, the stuff he says, you're like, man, I hope he's wrong. But the way he works it out, you're like, yeah, actually, he's probably right here.
Yeah. I mean, he also some of the major issues or outworkings, you might say, of the sexual revolution. We talked about Roe v. Wade, the issue of, for instance, transgenderism, or really any of the radical identity experiments that we see today. So he talks about, yes, there's a good chance if, say, Donald Trump is reelected, that he will work to undermine some of those symbolic gestures like Trans Recognition Day or something like that, or even Awareness Day, or even, maybe try to cancel some of them. And he said, those would be really no major victories, because bearing in mind what Nathan just talked about, the difference between climatological versus just staring at the actual weather changes, the climate has changed decisively in favor of sexual liberation, and that has happened in earnest since probably the 60s at some point. It's difficult to pinpoint the precise date, and has gone full blown. Now, here's where we'll bring in some interesting items. And Hunter does have a habit, I've noticed. He did this in To Change the World, and it looks like Nathan and I haven't gotten our paws on this book yet, and we will, and we'll read it, and then probably you're going to have to suffer for it, because likely we'll have a lot of enthusiasm. But Hunter has a habit of kind of putting sort of provocative theses at the end of his book, and then not really unpacking them practically. He did that with the faithful presence within concept in To Change the World. It looks like he does something similar at the end of this book. But one of the points that he's making is we need poets, not politicians. Now, he's talking about he's using the word poet in kind of an expansive sense, although he means to indicate, of course, literal poets as well. But in other words, artists, the people who shape the imagination and the sensibilities of the nation. So it's impossible not to quote Percy Bysshe Shelley's famous "Poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the age" kind of deal. That's a very famous quote, but Hunter agrees. And so part of what he's talking about there is, I think he makes another statement, Nathan, and maybe you wrote it down, where he says the people who control culture control the perception of reality. Something along those lines.
Yes.
It's a pretty strong statement that he makes. Yeah.
Who gets to define what's real?
That's just who gets to define what's real. So that's just practically true. Now, if you look at our cultural artifacts, to use just a hideous term for the constellation of cultural products all around us, from everything from novels to TV shows to ads to what influencers are telling you, you will see very strong messages and a kind of consensus emerging on individualism, self-love, love in general, but it's a kind of nebulous conception of love as this purely kind of unconditional acceptance of anything. Well, now these are all very powerful cultural assumptions, but they're not reinforced primarily by seminars and philosophers and scientists. They're reinforced by people who are culture makers. And this is again to bring in to just go back to what Hunter had said, culture makers who make a real difference. It's not going to be, sort of the evangelical kind of Christian subculture, or those ghettos, those evangelical ghettos, like, I don't know. Oh, what is it? I can't even think of all of there are a couple of companies that are putting out major motion pictures, like God's Not Dead, War Room, others along those lines. Now, I'm not necessarily jabbing at these movies or anything like that. In fact, I haven't seen virtually anything. I mean, The Chosen actually comes to mind as well, which is it's a notch above for sure by any standard, I think, from what I've heard. Nathan's watched it. I haven't seen it yet. But these are largely just, even if they command a lot of high box office numbers or anything like that, they're really kind of a drop in the bucket compared to, I mean, they're not going to do anything even remotely close to what major studio productions are doing. The imaginative visions that are coming through those major studios. Again, those are huge centers of cultural influence.
Okay,
And so
hang on.
Hunter is saying,
and
yeah,
even
let's
if they
pause
did,
there for a second.
and even if they did, you wouldn't hear about it in the news.
Right, because who controls the news?
Right,
but,
yeah.
But no, but here's I don't know, I might disagree with you slightly here, Nathan. You're right on the one hand, yes, who controls the media and all of that, but part of so let me give an example. So people are probably a little discouraged right now listening to this. So let me give an example of somebody there. It will get better. Let me name two Christian artists for you right now who are making a tangible, real difference and who are moving and who are cultural elites. One of them is Terrence Malick, who is a filmmaker.
Okay.
Oh, come on. You stole my... Oh, well, there it goes. And so here's the second... No, I'm just kidding. So,
okay, Terrence Malick. Yep.
All right. Terrence Malick.
So we're film world here.
I'll talk a tiny bit about him and then a tiny bit about the other person. The other one is Marilyn Robinson. So, and you know what? Let's go ahead and throw Wendell Berry in there. Wendell Berry is a person of massive cultural influence, and ironically, among cultural elites, many of whom he would probably roll his eyes at. But I mean, if you have an actor like Nick Offerman, who you probably don't even know who that is, Nathan, because you're too good.
Nope.
But he was on Parks and Rec. He was on the show. Yeah, Ron Swanson. Anyway, Ron Swanson or Nick Offerman actually did the audiobook for The Need to Be Whole, Wendell Berry's latest book.
Interesting.
But so here's my point. These are three consummate Christian artists who are making very powerful, in terms of quality, I mean, works of genius levels of art with beautiful, non-corny, redemptive arcs. So Terrence Malick is a filmmaker, burst onto the scene with Badlands, which is an extremely powerful, very unsettling movie about two teenagers who went on a killing spree. It's based on a true story. Martin Sheen and Sissy Spacek. It's a great movie, but you've been warned. But then also The Thin Red Line and Tree of Life, most famously, and then recently A Hidden Life, which is just, Nathan has seen that. Absolute, devastating, amazing, beautiful film. Marilyn Robinson burst onto the scene with Housekeeping, which is, I hate her for that being her debut novel. It is so beautifully written and so good. But then probably most famous for Gilead, which is one of my favorite recent novels about a pastor, and it's just so gorgeous. And then Wendell Berry, of course, written numerous works of fiction and nonfiction. But these are three serious Christian artists who are making a very real difference, who are swaying public opinion. But we need more of that kind of thing.
Okay, Cameron. So hang on. You've blown up a wonderful balloon here, and I'm going to pop it now using James Davision Hunter on this. Okay, so
yeah,
I think people listening along will say that's great. But here's the thing. Culture might be interested in them, but there would be a significant portion of the church that doesn't accept them. And not in artistic terms, but none of them voice conservative political positions publicly. And here's what Hunter says. So I was listening to, I think we both listened to the interview that Russell Moore from Christianity Today, you probably know the name Russell Moore, did with James Davision Hunter. And so when Hunter was saying that there's no positive or negative concept for solidarity that is around tribalism, Russell Moore asked him, why do you think it is that Christians are now more likely to form tribes with people they identify with politically rather than other Christians? So we tolerate phenomenal differences of opinion on all sorts of theological matters in order to be in the same political camp as somebody. Pick your Tucker Carlson to Ben Shapiro to whatever, like people that you have almost nothing theologically or spiritually in common with, but you can overlook that. However, if you have somebody who has almost the identical core set of beliefs that you do, but has a different perspective on climate change, they're out. They're a liberal. They don't vote for the right things. So this is the danger here, is that we're forming tribes. So Russell Moore says to James Davision Hunter, why is it that our political tribalism supersedes our religious convictions, and that our tribe is no longer formed around our core Christian beliefs. And Hunter's response is heartbreaking and probably true. He said, whenever that happens historically, what you see is the internal secularization of the church. So I think you could come out, Cameron, and say, hey, Marilyn Robinson. And I guarantee you that if people looked into Marilyn Robinson's political views or Wendell Berry's political views, they would throw them right out on their heads and say, yeah, but you're not with us. You're against us. Even though these are people who, so this idea of the internal secularization of the church manifesting itself as our ability to form tribes, not just outside the church, but against some of the core frameworks that we share collectively within the church, I think is a deep indictment of the church right now. And so while we can, like, the sky is falling politics, we probably want to really think deeply about the core of our places of worship.
Okay, so I think we've earned the right to now be a little bit more harsh at this point, because we gave the other side. We did talk about the other side of the coin earlier with sympathy, saying evangelicals in particular, theologically conservative people, let's say in general, that's a more expansive category in America, find themselves backed into a wall. And the only place where they have any real influence is politics. Okay, so there is that piece.
Wait, Cameron, hang on. Wait, all right. Please. Can I hang on? Let me just say this, because I think I know where you're going. Hold your thought. And I want to outline for those of you who are maybe new to listening to this, the difficulty that Cameron and I run into when we start talking about politics. So here's what happens. As we start hesitating on the like all the eggs of the church in the basket of partisan politics. And so we'll say things like, maybe this isn't where you want to invest everything. And people will say to us, you are not taking seriously enough the cultural dangers that are alive and well within the political system. And that is, so you come across as liberal if you second guess the conservative play here politically. And Cameron and I do not fit in that category. We would say that that things are culturally way worse than you could possibly understand or recognize just watching the news, and that they're so bad that it's naive to think that the political system is the thing that's going to fix it. And so this is where if you go down this line of thinking, you can be so politically conservative that you start to appear or you can be so Christianly conservative that you start to appear politically apathetic, when it's not that. You're just saying, okay, actually the problem is way deeper than who the president is or who gets into Congress, in the next term. The problem's way deeper than that. And the work is way harder than just voting. And so we're not disparaging that as not important. We're just to say, like, think about that for a second. Is that really where the core of this fight is at? So we have a vision that the world is worse and that the church is better, and that the final outcome. So that's why I think Hunter plays so well kind of into the thinking out loud milieu in which we operate. Paradigm. Is the paradigm, because he's articulating that things are way more broken than Fox News can fix. So you have these institutions that help us point out the things that are wrong, but so they're wonderful at critiquing, but they are pathetic sources of hope. So when we get to talking to the church, so I didn't want to cut you off there, but I think it's important that we stick that in there to say we are not naive about. And if you listen to this, you're going to hear us being way more pessimistic on the culture war as a place to heavily invest as Christians from a political standpoint.
Well,
end of rant.
What I hope you walk away. Well, what I hope you walk away with is the notion, or that we at least play some part in pushing some of us to think more. We absolutely must have prayer. The tools and strategies at our disposal are helpful, and we want to use them, and we want to be responsible citizens. but it is not, in the end, up to us to save the world. We can't do that. We are people of God, and we belong to God's kingdom, and therefore we have a Savior. And so we recognize his reign, his authority, and his supremacy. So he is ultimately the one who will exercise sovereignty and control. And so we look to him. Now, that's not an abdication of our responsibility, but here's why I think that internal secularization thesis is so damning in some cases. Because what it really does is it unveils, to use apocalyptic language, unbelief, deep-seated unbelief. Because here's the thing. In the end, if you think we're backed into a corner and that leads you down a road of ends justifying the means logic, which I'm going to be frank, I've heard a lot of from many different people whom I love and respect. And I haven't, by the way, I haven't shut down those relationships. I haven't walked away from those people just because I have deep disagreements with them, but I have pointed out loud and tried to, and it's been awkward and uncomfortable, that this is a kind of thinking, a kind of pragmatism that is very dangerous, because essentially what you're saying is, well, if I'm backed into the wall, I mean, I want to do something for the greater good, so I'm going to trade in my convictions, downplay some areas, and in some cases just throw them out because we need to win. And winning is really, really important. This is a dire situation. We need to fight hard. And that means we might need to fight dirty or deploy some bad tactics, but we, in the end, will get the right result. So we're saying, and most Christians who resist idolatry and that internal secularization will say, this betrays a sense of unbelief, because it's a kind of faithlessness, saying, well, God isn't strong enough for us to play by his rules. So therefore, we need to take matters into our own hands. And now, most people, well, of course, we're not going to spell it out in those kinds of words. Usually, we find ways of rationalizing. The rationalizations that you'll see in the political sphere are pretty just stunning. I mean, one of the recent examples that I've seen, and I mean, regardless of where you fall on the spectrum here, I'm not going to walk on eggshells and be all careful. It's pretty apparent who I'm not in sympathy with in political office, but I've seen. One argument that really stood out to me was now arguing for, we've seen Trump as a kind of Cyrus figure. We've seen him portrayed as a Bonhoeffer figure. And then recently we've seen him portrayed as a tragic kind of military general like Sherman or something. These are just examples of the kind. Now, if you know anything about those people I just named and Donald Trump, you'll know that is an absurd comparison. These people, there are no similarities there. These are completely different people, but everybody playing word games and trying to sort of dress up the language to push forward a political agenda they've found very creative outlets for doing so. But these are, if we're going to remain faithful to Christ, his word, and his way, it's going to require of us faith in his power. But also, so then to bring those artists back into play here, Nathan did pop the balloon. We're going to have to rethink what victory looks like to us. We have to think in terms of a long game.
When the Son of Man returns, will he find faith on the earth? Is the question.
Right. And so, couple things to bear in mind here. We're invested while we're here, and we care, and we want to do what we can to ensure a high quality of life for people around us, and we want to be responsible citizens. But we also have to recognize that we're in the tension of we have the full reign of Christ has not been realized on earth, in the sense that we're not inhabiting the new heavens and the new earth just yet. But what we do, nevertheless, does matter and is of crucial significance and carries real moral weight. But also, we need to recognize, Nathan said it's harder work than politics. Part of what we mean, it's deeper than that. Well, what do we mean by that? Well, human beings are spiritual creatures. So Christians, we ought to be the ones who lead the way with a good anthropology and recognizing that if you want real change in a culture, you have to touch people. It has to be an inside out dynamic. We have actually seen that in the past.
So here are a couple places.
Yeah.
Here are a couple places where I think he has some ideas that go along with that. I want to back up first and say that actually, I think you and I model what we're talking about here in the sense that we have some pretty big theological differences, from baptism to modesty to the spiritual significance of clowns to, fill in the blank.
Sure.
We're not part of the same denomination. We have some robust, respectful conversations around these things at times. But that does not mean that I don't know. So I like what we're able to do here together, despite not being 100%, carbon copies of each other. And so I hope
we have
that
Christian solidarity.
Yeah, we have Christian solidarity that transcends some of our So there's that. Now, what you were just saying about the spiritual work and the touching people, he said in his interview, James Davision Hunter said in his interview with Russell Moore that, and I wrote. That's not an exact quote. I wrote this down. He said, "We need to learn to apply our ideals to actual human beings." And I thought, so this is a spot where the church is ahead. This is where we're actually good. So we need to learn to apply our ideals to actual human beings. But I mean, that goes both ways. So stop having these conversations theoretically. If you want to talk about abortion, think about actual people. If you want to talk about, and so this is where I think, hey, good job, church. Like, we're working on this, but don't slip on that. Don't give up on that. So there's that. Then Cameron, not in the interview link that you sent, but in one I was watching with him with Aaron Wren, James, and this is exciting to me. It's crazy that I would think we're in such a spot that this is exciting. James Davision Hunter said we are in a post-secular age. And Aaron Wren was like, what in the world do you mean by a post-secular age? He said, there are no good philosophers anymore. He said there are no good modern philosophers who are making a justifiable argument for why secularism is better than any other system of belief or epistemology right now. And so there's a little bit of room here.
We don't have our Jürgen Habermas.
Yeah. So there's a little bit here of like the culture war and what's considered ethically okay. There's not a lot of work to be made. I don't see a lot of market potential there, to use Cameron's phrase, a hideous phrase. But in this idea that we're now philosophically running into a place where the playing field is kind of leveled, in the sense that there isn't a dominant secular philosophy. I'm speaking academically from like a moral foundation category here, that can say what's right or wrong or what's true or false or better. It just is. And so this is exciting because the church is like, we actually have a foundation for saying something here. So we are not. So if we can keep from internally secularizing over politics, we have a message here. And it's all in all the stuff that Cameron's been saying about we're spiritual creatures. We believe, that we're not alone here, that, God is involved, that Christ has a redemptive plan, that forgiveness is possible. Like, all right, the gospel, if you've been listening along here for years, but all of that is good. And we have the framework, we have the hardware, we have the software, we have the personnel, we have the buildings and the small bits of institution to make a wonderful declaration within our culture that really doesn't have an alternative, if we don't adopt the culture's techniques and then crush ourselves in it's like sticking your head in the guillotine to see if it works. Like, just don't do that.
Okay,
church.
may I give an example here?
Yeah, please.
Okay, here's one that worked, and it took a long time. I mean, at least 100 years. And this is drawn directly from Hunter. So he talked about the long and prolonged journey away from chattel slavery, but really the real battle was against racism, but really the hearts and minds of people in America. And so he talked about the laws and how they were, all said and done, not that helpful, but you had an imaginative reworking that was taking place as well, that began to affect the hearts and minds of people. So I want to give some examples he didn't. So, and I'll complicate it for a second too. Uncle Tom's Cabin is an interesting book. It's an interesting cultural artifact, but by all accounts, all critical accounts, it's a pretty lousy novel. It's got a heart of gold. It's just really badly written. But so I'm not gonna use that one. I'm gonna use a different one. I'm gonna show you how artists are unacknowledged legislators of the age, and that is Huckleberry Finn. So Huckleberry Finn, not not a soft or sentimental story. So much so, it's routinely been banned from school reading lists because of some of the harsh language in it and all of that. Mark Twain was very true to the way people were speaking, and that included racist slurs. But the character of Jim, whom Huck befriends, gave a human face to an African American man who was a slave, and helped people to do something that's very, very powerful: to see things otherwise, to imagine things otherwise. To Kill a Mockingbird performed a similar service. It's a powerful book. And if you know the story, the ending. It does not have an ideal ending. But this book was a monumental piece of art that helped to change perception. It helped people to see things otherwise. It humanized somebody who, for many, especially in the South where this was written, people did not see certain people in human terms, and it did that. Okay. Yeah. This is working in the terms of appealing to people's spirits too. That's what art does. Yeah. So imagine, real quick, imagine something along those lines. Again, I'm picking examples very carefully. It has not corny. It's got to be organic. It's got to be real. It's got to be true work of art. Something along those lines for the issue of abortion, identity politics, or something to do with immigration. I mean, there are issues today that carry the same weight. Obviously, racism remains a huge issue in our nation in different ways, but there have been some real moral victories when it comes to the issue of race. Let's just admit that. That's a good thing, and that's to be celebrated. Similar victories can also happen with some of these other issues. Yeah.
But so James Davision Hunter would say that before the Civil War, there was 30 years of a culture war over whether or not a black person was a full human.
Yeah.
He said that shooting wars always come after. You never have a shooting war before you have a culture war. That there's a link there. And so what we don't want to sound like we're saying here, just to be clear, is an Emancipation Proclamation. Great. Half the nation wasn't there yet, but it saved a whole lot of people from being slaves and getting killed.
Oh yeah. We're in favor of it. Yes.
So Dobbs, great. Like, if you're for abortion, you don't say, hey, well, this only saved a couple million lives, so no big deal. We're not like, I understand that. But what we're saying is that there's work to do deeper than that, and that the long-term impact of how this actually gets worked out with real people is a challenge. Cameron, I wonder if I can, this is getting long here, and I'm sure we'll come back to some of these themes, but I want to end with I tried to write this down verbatim. James Davision Hunter's quote about ending statement about hope. And let me read this to you, and then you can comment and we'll wrap this up. He said, hope is the recognition that the world may not get better, that it might take a long time. It might get worse before it gets better. But there is an order to the cosmos, and there is justice, a flourishing that will come to pass, and we work toward it. We need leaders to work toward these conditions of renewal. And it's a odd and striking quote when he starts off saying that hope is the recognition that the world might not get better, because it instantly makes you think about, so when do you think, like, how do you have hope in a world that doesn't get better? And only a Christian can say something like that. And at the same time say, and we're going to work for renewal now in the midst of that. But I want to spend some time thinking about that quote and go back, and if I can find that written down somewhere, look at it a little bit. but something seemed right to me about that. How did it strike you?
It struck me as so right because we routinely mix up hope and optimism, and they're not the same thing. And it also, I think, demonstrates that what's two of the qualities that are very needed in that we need to cultivate as Christian men and women are patience and faith. Patience because things might not get better in our lifetimes, but we still doggedly, persistently do what is right. Now, that doesn't mean, no, your salvation remains secure in all of that. So this is where faith comes in. Your faith is ultimately, it is a principled sense of trust and conviction in your Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ, knowing that your ultimate well-being and all the ultimate well-being period is secured. It has been secured decisively through his life, death, and resurrection. And now we live by his spirit in this world now. So that I'm not saying, so when I say, things might not get better, we're talking about cultural factors and politics and some of the stuff around you. That doesn't mean your quality of existence needs to necessarily be totally degraded. I mean, you walk in newness of life now, in whatever circumstances you find yourself. And that could be anywhere from, if you look at the Bible, plague, famine, prison cells. I mean, Paul's letters are coming to us. Some of these epistles are coming to us from a prison cell, and we know the way their lives ended as well. So if you have a short-term vision, or you think in terms of short-term victories, right, of the weather, it's a counsel of despair. I mean, look at, and sometimes of course, the heroes of our faith struggled with this as well. Notably, John the Baptist, as he's sitting in that royal prison cell and sending messengers to inquire whether Jesus is in fact the one, or whether they should look for another. So we all struggle with this. We all, kind of falter in our steps. That's human. This is also why we need each other. This is also why we have to go to church to worship the Lord in spirit and in truth, and have these eternal truths impressed on us every single week. We need that. So, yes, patience and faith and Christian community. These are going to carry us a long way. But I think that quote is going to be sobering for many of us, because I think a lot of Christians, just without meaning to, have by default kind of bought into a naive kind of hope, or really more a sense of sort of optimism that is clearly not reflected in our realities these days. We can't sustain that illusion anymore. So we're going to have to rethink that. And we're going to have to come to terms once again with do I really believe? I think belief is a huge thing. I keep coming back to that, Nathan, right now, because I'm seeing so many unbelief is manifesting itself in ways we had not anticipated. We had concentrated so heavily in the church, on very powerful arguments, for instance, for the existence of God and for the divinity of Christ. These are important arguments and all of that, but unbelief has crept in places we didn't anticipate, having to do with the actual way our world is run, the way our lives go. And it turns out that a lot of our thought categories have actually been co-opted by lines of thinking that have very little to do with Scripture, God, His Word, and what His people say.
So let's do this. Yeah. I got a plan. Worship the Lord in spirit and truth. Invest in your church, and grow and build and strengthen the Christians around you. Cheer for one another in order to be the type of church that can meet the actual needs of the world around you. Do this in the knowledge that the church wins in the end. Christ is victorious. And that'll give you a sense of hope that I think is contagious and much needed in a weary, post-secular, super confused world. There you have it. The words of Jesus are not difficult to understand, but they do take a certain degree of resignation, like total, in order to actually effectually live them out in the world. And so that's the thing that we're plodding along toward here when we're getting all hyper about some of these books and ideas and what's going on in the culture. And we love that you guys are thinking through this with us and seeing it as part of a process of us trying to really discern how do we live well as the people of God in this time and in this place. You've been listening to Thinking Out Loud, a podcast where we think out loud about current events and Christian hope.
Thanks for listening to Thinking Out Loud. If you'd like to learn more about what we do, book Nathan or Cameron, or if you'd like to support us financially, whether through a one-time donation or on a monthly basis, you can do so on the donate page at www.toltogether.com. That's toltogether.com. And please consider leaving us a 5-star rating and sharing this content with your friends. It really does help.